Now, President Zelensky says Ukraine was surprised to be excluded from the talks in Riyadh. Mr. Zelensky spoke in Ankara after the U.S.-Russia meeting wrapped up. He's there to discuss the war with his Turkish counterpart. Now, President Zelensky said that he wants the war to end, but added that, quote, no one decides anything behind our backs. Europe is also, as you can imagine, concerned about the U.S. and Russia speaking behind its back. That's why European leaders held an emergency summit in Paris Monday. The French president says he will host additional talks tomorrow. Leigh Turner is the former British ambassador to Ukraine, and he joins us now. Grateful to have you on the program. What do you believe should be Ukraine's next move here? And how can Europe better support Zelensky, who, by his own words, seems to be frozen out here, frozen out of his own country's future?
Well, it's been a chaotic week, hasn't it, Paula? We've seen President Trump apparently pushing for a rapid peace deal, which would be immensely damaging to Ukraine. It seems that he wants to ignore Europe, and any bad peace will be storing up massive problems for the future, including for the US. So Zelensky up to now has been really quite diplomatic. He's bent over backwards not to be disrespectful about President Trump and his chaos policies. He has said he will only meet Putin once Ukraine agrees a peace plan with the EU and the US. And he has observed rather dryly that he has not yet seen any sign of what Trump's peace plan, if there is one, might be. Now, as regards the Europeans, they really face a huge challenge here. The US has thrown down the gauntlet to Europe, including the UK, to raise their game on defense. And if they don't, the US is threatening to ignore Europe and make agreements with Russia over their heads without even consulting Ukraine. So there's various things Europe could do. I'd be happy to talk about those.
And I do want to get to that in a moment. We have no breaking news banners here. I mean, we're not talking about this in that context. And yet I can't help but feel that that is what we're talking about here in terms of the head-spinning change in U.S.-Russia relations just over the last few days. I want to point out that you say that after Russia annexed Crimea, you warned then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson that, in your words, Ukraine must be armed to the teeth because that's all Putin understands. But that categorically, I remind you, goes against the theory of any Trump doctrine here. He's the one who's now agreeing with Russia that NATO flexing on its eastern borders is what caused this war, essentially blaming the victim. So what do you do now if you're Europe? How can you step forward in this and counter what seems to be going on?
I think the first thing is that the transatlantic relationship is in totally uncharted waters. It's not necessarily holed beneath the waterline, but there are these major challenges. And Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, has talked about an emergency mindset being required. So I think, first of all, the Europeans have to increase their defense expenditure. This is going to be really difficult at a time when European electorates are worried about costs of living and energy costs and health costs and so on. And secondly, the European governments have to explain to their electorates why this is necessary. And then finally, Europeans have to try, in the face of this extraordinary, strange negotiating policy that the US administration seems to have adopted, to rebuild a load-bearing relationship between London and Washington, between Brussels and Washington. We've got Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, going to Washington next week, hoping to act as a bridge. We have the new British ambassador in Washington, Peter Mandelson, a former senior Labour politician. It'll be interesting to see how he can get on there. But this is all going to be extremely difficult. And it's made more difficult, as your correspondent was saying just now, by the way that Trump seems to be starting the negotiations by giving the Kremlin everything they want, breaking the relationship between the US and Europe, allowing Russia to keep some or all of the territory it's captured in Ukraine, allowing Russia to dictate terms that Ukraine can't join NATO. This is an extraordinary way to go about a negotiation.
Ambassador Turner, you've outlined the problem quite well. I think I continually ask of European officials, and I ask you, okay, it's okay to have an emergency mindset. When is that actually going to get to engagement? They need to do something, and they need to do it now. Do you believe that Keir Starmer will be the person to say, we're starting here, we're starting with committing British troops on the ground in Ukraine, and perhaps we can change the tone and tenor of this conversation?
I think that the Europeans do need to step up to the plate and show that they are serious about committing troops and money to defending Ukraine. This is going to be very difficult. We heard Sergei Lavrov today saying Russia would not accept any foreign troops as a peacekeeping force inside Ukraine. Now, just because Sergei Lavrov says that doesn't mean it can't happen. And Russia is going to have to make compromises as well in these negotiations. But it's difficult to see the landing zone, even if we do get UK, German, maybe French, Polish troops, possibly Swedish troops we heard, who are prepared to go to Ukraine to uphold a peace there. How are you going to get that far? How are you going to have a landing zone between Ukraine and Russia when, for a peace deal, when Ukraine is viscerally opposed to rewarding Russia with land for having invaded Ukraine, and Russia, they have been dragged into this conflict by Vladimir Putin, who has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of Russians in addition to slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And he has to come away from this conflict looking like a winner. So where that leaves any possible peace deal is hard to predict. And I think we're going to see Europe frantically trying to build bridges with the US, frantically trying to come up with some concrete security assurances it can give Ukraine. But the precedents are not good. We've seen that Russia has a absolutely cast iron tradition of breaking every agreement it enters into, from the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to the treaty it signed with Ukraine in 1997, the Partnership and Cooperation Treaty, under which it promised never to invade Ukraine and to recognize Ukraine's boundaries. So of course, Ukraine will want to have cast iron security guarantees.
As you said, that is the whole ball game, as they say here in the United States. It is those security guarantees. Leigh Turner, really appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much.